Just to make sure we're not on mute. All right, guys, we might get started now. So, thank you all for joining us this evening as we celebrate the launch of Frank Chalmers' new book, Conviction. My name's Eleanor and I'm part of the events team here at Avid Reader, and I'm going to be filling in for Ben Hobson in the conversation as he has taken ill, unfortunately. Before we commence, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land on which we're on in Meanjin this evening, the Yagara and Turrbal people, and traditional owners of the lands from which people are zooming in on tonight. I also pay my respects to elders past and present and acknowledge that we are on unceded land. So before we begin, there's a little bit of housekeeping. If we can pop our phones to silent. Bathroom access is inside. I never normally talk on the microphone. I'm so sorry, I don't know how to call it. You're doing. And bathrooms are just inside, up the stairs and down the corridor. If you need direction, there's staff inside. We also will be doing a book signing after we wrap up here. Just inside, the books are available to purchase. When we get to about 10 past, we'll jump to a Q&A, and people on Zoom absolutely post in the chat, and also, yeah, we encourage a lot of audience participation. And that's it. So now for the person of the hour, I'm going to introduce Frank here. Sorry. Frank Chalmers has a UQ bachelor's degree in philosophy and maths, and is a graduate of the Australian Film, Television and Radio School. He has taught high school and at university in science, philosophy, communication design and writing. He began a 40-year professional writing career on scripts for drama, in feature film, TV series and an interactive documentary. He moved to conceptual and interactive design for websites and games and has addressed conferences. He merged all of these skills into conceptual designer and content developer for museums and interpretive centres. He now writes novels. So let's jump into the convo. So I'd love to start by talking about your life's journey towards publishing the novel. Your bio is immense and amazing. It's actually a bit hard to find somewhere to start, but here we go. How long have you wanted to publish a novel for?
When I was quite young, even as young as, yes.
No, just for Zoom purposes.
Yes. When I was quite young, around 10, I decided that I wanted to be a writer, but I thought all writers were dead. And so I decided that wasn't possible. It never occurred to me to actually find out if that was true or not. And then it seemed too hard. And I wrote a script, sent it to the Australian Film Commission as it was then, and got a grant and decided Hollywood beckons, and took that path and stayed on that line for a long time.
You've been a teacher, a lecturer, scriptwriter, etc., and oversaw museum content. What did all these separate professions teach you in preparation for writing a novel?
You need to be sensitive to who you're addressing. At its crudest, that might mean that you write for an audience, but I don't feel that applies to a novel. It certainly applies to the museum, where it's tailored to demographics pretty tightly. But with a novel, there's a lot more freedom. A script is ruthless. You really cannot deviate from the spine of a script, whereas in a novel you can. If you deviate too far, of course, then that's no good, but you have room to move. So a novel was beckoned as a kind of freedom, really, that I couldn't have anywhere else.
Did you feel you had a lot more agency when writing a novel as opposed to following like? A
lot more agency, yes, but a lot more work as well, because in writing, an example is I had a producer for a 4-part miniseries, and parts of it was set in Chechnya, and the amount of research that I had to do to write those scenes was considerably less than I had to do if I were writing a novel. I had to do enough research to do it properly, but at some point when the script is handed over to a production team, the art directors take over and they fill in things like the kind of door that is on a house, the kind of window that is on a house, what the layout of the house is. I have to, as the writer of the script, you have to do that too. It's a difference of degree. And so while the novel gave me a lot more freedom, there are extra burdens as well.
Does your process change when writing a novel to writing a screenplay?
Oh, yes.
Yeah?
Yeah.
What are some ways that they differ?
Well, a script, I've been a script assessor, and one of the crude ways that script assessors will deny that they use is how much white space is on a page in a script. Because in a script, the white page should be, the white empty spaces should be maximized. Whereas that sort of thing doesn't apply in a novel. I feel it's been, I feel the discipline that came from writing scripts has been invaluable, and that I'm much the better writer, such as I am, for having been a scriptwriter first. At the same time, it makes me perhaps too intolerant of anything that I'm reading that has too many words.
Superfluous.
I can't bear it. It drives me crazy.
Yeah.
And perhaps I go too far in that direction. Ben, who's absent, his Snake Island is not riddled with superfluous words. And I really enjoyed it for that.
Avoiding that sort of like hyperbole kind of, yeah. Were there any particular challenges you found when writing a novel that you didn't anticipate?
Well, if I say no, that makes it sound like I found it easy, and it was not easy. But it wasn't that I found, no, I don't think so. I say that with great trepidation because, as I said, it makes it sound like I had no problems, and believe me, that's not true. But I found that the issues of structure and you know, the craft issues weren't so dissimilar, given that my bias is towards the scarcity of words that is in a script, as distinct from a lot of novels. So no, I think I found it. I mean, some writers talk about the looseness of a novel. Some famous writer has described, I can't remember who, has described the novel as like a rag bag, you know, because it has no particular shape. You can't say what shape a novel should be. There are too many variations. But that can be threatening when you're trying to work out where to stop at a particular point and move on. Because it's always so tempting to go on and on and on. And in a novel, you can't do that either. But it's a more significant temptation in a novel than it would ever be in a script, in my feelings. And my feelings about it anyway.
One of my questions now. So, with your background in screenwriting, when you were developing this, do you have already in mind like how it could be adapted, or are they two really separate kind of things in your mind?
Well, if it were to be adapted, the first thing that I would have to talk about with the producer would be what they are going to change. And I have a secret list of what I believe they will say has to change. And I'm totally confident that I'm right. But I feel that if they change those things, they've misunderstood.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure that it will be adapted. I know I shouldn't say that because it'll put off a producer who might give me a large sum of money to do the adaptation. But perhaps because I've written scripts, I have my tests.
Yeah.
Or traps.
Would you want to be the screenwriter for it, or
No.
would you go? Yeah.
No.
Leave it in someone else's hands.
Yeah, I think it's just that you wear yourself out.
Yeah.
I wore myself out on the novel, and I know the energy that is required to do it as a script. And I'm not sure that I want to expend that energy, because my agent has told me that I should be working on book 2 now. And I'd rather be doing that than going back to a script.
So you think that this character, Ray, he'll be continuing on? We'll be reading him?
Yeah. This process, I'm afraid I did it in reverse. I wrote a draft about 8 years ago and sent it to a person for assessment. And amidst several insights, because she was very good. Her name is Siboney Duff. I recommend her strongly as a person who can read your work and give you comments. She said that there were 3 books here that needed to be separated.
Oh, wow.
And so that struck me very, very strongly. I hadn't thought about that. And so I wrote a draft from that. And then when I looked at it, I thought that there were bits missing to make it work. So I had to write a book that came historically before that. So I wrote that book. Then I thought that book 2, that second book, needed another book that historically came before that to fill out better what was in books 2 and 3. So Conviction is the last of the 3. And the other 2 are there that I'm working on at the moment. And what I've done has been well received. I did it backwards. I wrote book 3, then book 2, then book 1. And what I've discovered is that the process I went through with Alan and Unwin, with the editors, was so valuable. I've always loved being edited.
Yeah.
I really enjoy it. It's great. The process that I went through with the editors from Alan and Unwin was so rich.
And like encouraging for you.
And it was intense. It was intense. There were no holds barred. But I really enjoyed it. And now, because of what I feel I've learned from that process, I now look at what is now book 2 and 3 and think, ooh, I've got a lot to do.
Yeah, there's some work to do in the future.
Yeah.
Right. Well, how about we move into some writing questions? Do you feel like you're more driven by character or by plot, or a bit of both?
Yeah, well, it's a bit of both. My wife Julie will tell you that I reach a point where my characters speak to me in really spooky ways. I try to get them to do things and they actually say no. They won't do them. And they actually have suggestions for me. I'm not normally a spooky person, but it's very odd. Or else I'll find that, for instance, during the editing process, more than once the editors would say, well, we think such and such should happen here. And then I thought, well, I see why you're saying that, but if I'm going to do that there, I have to put all this other stuff in earlier. And then I find all that stuff is in earlier. And I just didn't tie it together properly. So that there are strange ways that character and plot work together. And it'll happen out of the blue. I can be doing anything. And all of a sudden, I'll say that, oh, I get it. He has to go there. I didn't know that. And
just sort of almost along for the journey with them.
Yeah.
When I was reading this afternoon, like a lot of the reviews that have started coming in for your work, tense, terse, gritty, atmospheric, harsh, a lot of really visceral, descriptive kind of words to describe it. What went into sort of crafting the setting and the space, and the fact that the Australian sort of outback is as much a character as everything else?
Because of the museum work, I've been working with some good people here for 20 years. mostly out west on museum projects, I've interviewed many, many people on camera and off. And they taught me a lot, I guess. When you're interviewing somebody, you have to listen as well as talk. And I really liked the people. There were a lot of events and incidents that I wish I could have. I've got to tell this story. This story was told to me by the man's mother. When you're trying to break up a paddock to plant whatever you're planting, wheat or sorghum or whatever, there's a plough called, well, when I was a kid on a cane farm, it was called a scarify. It's just a lot of hooks that you pull through the ground. And what he was finding is that the hooks were bouncing over the ground because the ground was too hard. And so he had to put a particular weight on the plough. And what he put on the plough was an unexploded bomb.
Oh,
The sort of bomb that you see in the movies thrown out of a plane, or dropping from a plane. It's a big thing. And the Department of Defence were called out, and it was verified that it was a bit of a giveaway. It was an unexploded bomb. And so they took the bomb away. And I said to the woman, the mother, who was telling me the story, that it seemed like a pretty risky thing to do. And she said, oh, Nick's a bit like that. And she said, we put in a new bore. And, whenever you put it, this is out past Miles, the Artesian Basin territory. And when you put in a new bore, you're not quite sure what actually will come out. It's a mixture of water and gas, but you don't always know what sort of gas. And so when the first products were coming out of the bore, they were wondering what it was and whether or not it would be explosive, because some of it is. He said, we'll see. So he went over and lit a match and it exploded. And he wasn't hurt, but he was blown away. I mean, there are stories that I would love to have included, but it's difficult to find rooms.
Maybe 2 and 3.
Maybe 2 and 3.
Yeah. See, bear with me, guys. Talk about the creation of Ray Windsor, your main protagonist. He has such an interesting backstory. What went into crafting him?
I'm not really sure. I'm not sure where Ray came from. In an interview that I did last week, I was asked about him being a boxer and having a tendency to violence and temper. And it struck me that during the interview, that something I'd never thought of before, that Lee Child, in creating Jack Reacher, made a deliberate decision that Jack Reacher would be big, strong, and could look after himself in almost every physical situation. So that in the Jack Reacher stories, the idea that the hero gets beaten up and hurt, which is such an ordinary thing to have in novels like that, it never arises because he's always the master of the physical situations that he's in. And I hadn't thought about it. As I said, it only came to me during the interview, that in a way, making Ray effective as someone who could fight took that burden away from me. So, I mean, there's a story about Hollywood movies that in any movie that Marlon Brando is in, the audience want him to be hurt. That's just something that people want with Marlon Brando. And if you watch a lot of, who's the guy in Die Hard? I keep forgetting his name. Bruce Willis. Bruce Willis has, in a way, has tried to cash in on that because Bruce Willis gets thumped, in the Die Hard movies and so on. But it's not the same thing. And why am I talking about this?
Ray.
Ray's a boxer. I mean, I knew a bit about boxing because I boxed. I've boxed. I was never any good, but I did it. In fact, the first tournament that I went in, I was still in high school, and my dad walked round and round the ring with a white towel.
Get out of there.
There wasn't a lot of expectation.
Yeah.
But it gave me an appreciation of being physical like that, which I don't know that I am really. And with my museum colleagues, we did a project about 20 years ago, actually. And in the course of it, I had to interview a lot of, would you believe, ex-boxing champions from Ipswich in the 1950s. And it was fascinating. And
What were they like? Tough guys.
Yeah, they were, actually. I had this strange notion that with one of them, there could be a photo of me in the ring with him just shaping up. And when I shook his hand, I knew that was not all. And he was in his 70s.
Wow.
In fact, he and his mate, well, he wasn't really his mate, another ex-boxer, they put on a demonstration boxing match, which was supposed to be just for fun. And when those guys put on the boxing gloves in their 70s, decades after they'd been in the ring, oh, it got me in tough.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
There's an undercurrent. This is another sort of question. There's an undercurrent throughout book that's sort of racial and gender inequalities.
Yeah.
At least, like, I think a lot of an air of real authenticity of like the 1970s. But we're still seeing like a lot of it today. Was that important for you to address it in the book?
Yes, it was.
Yeah.
It's whilst the Fitzgerald report was crucial to my finding what I wanted to write about, those issues are not big at all in the Fitzgerald report. And having met a lot of people out west, nowhere near as many as I might, but still, I don't think it's as bad as it was in the 70s. In fact, anybody would find it interesting if you contact the Australian Bureau of Statistics and ask them for a cultural background on every town in Australia, you will find that the cultural diversity is actually huge. So that somebody said to me, wow, there's a lot of, how about all those different refugees and everything living in that town? That's a bit weird. Well, it's backed by the statistics.
Yeah.
And in fact, I didn't make as much of it as I might have. But yeah, it matters to me.
Yeah.
We're in Australia at the moment, a lot of Indigenous writing is being published, but there are still barriers to getting a lot of Indigenous characters into what otherwise might be white stories.
Yeah.
It's difficult. But by using the racial, the different racist attitudes that were in that fictitious town, and also by introducing the Armenian, the Turkish genocide against Armenia, and mind you, it wasn't only the Turks, but that's another story. It was a kind of a parallel to having Indigenous characters without having.
Yeah.
The fact that the police out west in my story could be indifferent to the deaths of two migrant kids, I don't think that's, I don't believe that's far-fetched for a minute in the 70s, not for a minute. But the important thing is that those migrant groups and families, they were there. Yeah. They were in the towns. And it's often overlooked. You know, there's an idea, a lot of people have an idea of an Australian country town as pretty homogenous. Yeah. Well, what you see might be homogenous at first glance, but actually the statistics suggest something different.
Yeah. And they think that because there's, you know, we've still got an ongoing issue with deaths in custody. It's like, you know, no one can't help but see the parallels between the two. Yeah.
Yeah.
What about the sort of the rape and murder of the young women, the way they mostly seem ignored, but this is a question from Ben, by many, this too is something we're still seeing in our current world. Was this an important part of crafting the novel?
Yes, it was. Yes, it was. One night, whilst looking for something to watch on Netflix, which is kind of a cultural event for so many of us these days, the show, whatever it was, started with a young woman in torn clothes running through a forest at night, looking distraught. And we turned it off. And I just couldn't bear to watch another show that depicted that. However, on the other side, these things happen. Statistically, we know the disturbing number of women who are killed in Australia every week through mostly male violence. Yeah. So it's a puzzle to know how to deal with it. There is a Netflix show with Toni Collette as a cop. Is it Ungovernable? I can't believe it.
Unbelievable.
Unbelievable, which I think sets a whole new standard on how you can deal with something that is so, threatens to be so cliched, but needs to be examined.
And sort of like avoiding that kind of exploitative level of it.
Yeah.
And that gratuity to violence. Yeah.
Exactly. It's actually a live issue for me in book 2, because I realised in going back to it after a couple of years away from it, that at least one of the scenes in that draft were there to kind of make people pay attention to the violence that was happening. But then I realised that just makes it more gratuitous.
And your attitudes have changed in sort of.
So I don't know, it's a puzzle. And there's a lot of talk going on in the crime genre that on how to deal with violence with women, against women. And the other is how to deal with the trust, the integrity of the cops. That, you know, that there is a view of the crime genre that says it's like sitcoms, which some argue are inherently conservative because they always tend to take things back. You know, their resolution is to take things back to what they were at the beginning. Well, they don't need to be that way, but it's hard when. I mean, I had a clash with audience expectations on the end of Conviction. And it was about exactly that point. How do you resolve the story in a way that doesn't just be cliche and so on?
Definitely.
It's a much bigger subject than can be dealt with here. I mean, I copped out in a way too, so to speak, because I said it in Queensland in the 1970s. The question of the cops having integrity wasn't an issue. And 2 comments in Conviction are taken from quotes in the Fitzgerald report. And one is one policeman saying that when you met another cop, you tended to assume they were on the take. And the other quote from the report was talking about verbaling. I assume people know what verbaling is. That this cop said, well, you don't worry about the facts. You sit at the typewriter and you make it up. So that there was a sense in which conviction in ordinary circumstances would be a police procedural, whereas I see it as an anti-procedural. Because it was very important to me to get the point across that the 2 cops trying to do the right thing had no court of appeal. And if you know that something bad is going on and you're the only one that can do anything about it, are you up to it? And that was what I wanted to pursue. I don't care about the people who are at the top of the take. They're greedy and they're boring. You know, there's not much to say about them. But ordinary people faced with those sorts of moral choices, it really fascinates me, because I don't know if I'd be brave enough to do it either. It's tough.
Definitely. I feel like, you know, you've made a lot of mention to like the Fitzgerald inquiry. Is like research really important in your process of building the story. Yeah.
Oh yeah. But at the same time, I don't know if I would call conviction realist.
Right.
You know, it's hard to.
Yeah.
That's a tricky label.
Mm.
There's what Alfred Hitchcock called the icebox effect, and maybe I'm one of the few people in the room who are old enough to know what an icebox was. Before people had refrigerators, you had an icebox, and an iceman would come, and it was a man, would come every day and would drop an icebox, an ice block into your icebox, your icebox. And excuse me, they'd come, and then, you know, it'd gradually melt and the water would run off, and the next day they'd bring a new one. And Hitchcock's icebox effect was to do with whether or not his films were realistic. And he said he didn't care. The only thing he cared about was if the person who's been to his film gets up at 3 a.m. because they want a drink of water or milk or something, and they go to the icebox. It shows you how long ago Hitchcock was making movies. And they go to the icebox, and as they get the drink, they think, damn, how did he get from there to there in the story? He couldn't have, because there were no way, you know, etc. He said, if they wake up at 3 a.m. and discover a hole in the story, I don't care. If they came out of the cinema saying, wow, wasn't that great?
That was great. No thoughts about it. Yeah.
Well, you know, I don't think crime novels are social documents. You know, I just think that they're for pleasure and maybe a bit of serious consideration along the way.
So who's sort of in that kind of rural noir sort of crime, who really inspires you from that? Are there sort of kind of reminds me Wake and Fright a little bit, this kind of setting.
Yeah, well, I welcome parallels to Wake and Fright because the relationships between men and in Wake and Fright, the word mate gets a clobbering because it is so often used as a threat. If someone calls you mate, you're in trouble. I've lost my thread. I mean,
your inspiration, sort of like any of those authors, kind of do you draw inspiration from them?
Oh,
in
any
that kind
authors?
Of raw noir, or in general film as well.
Well, none come to mind because I keep thinking about book 2, which is what I'm doing. It's a bit self-serving.
It can't be a bad thing to be your own source of inspiration.
It's a bit self-serving. I think Peter Temple's, if we're talking about people whose writing I admire, Peter Temple, his book Truth, I think, which won the Miles Franklin, I think that it's a standard that nobody has beaten. If we're talking globally, Tana French, what she writes, she is so good. Her books are so good. I feel so filled up by her books that when I've wanted to start another one straight away and I can't, I have to wait for Tana French. There's a book called Game by Trevor Shearston, which actually was about a bushranger. I love that book. It's very good. I've just discovered a book called Still by Nabal. I've forgotten his first name. Anyway, it's very good. Then Snake Island is very good. It's hard. I mean, the standards for the genre are Ian Rankin or Sir Ian Rankin and Michael Connelly. And there are very good reasons why they're the standards. They're not the sort of things that I do, but they impress me with what they do.
Definitely.
Yeah. It gets a bit hard after a while to know which of their books you've read and which haven't, because there's so many.
They're prolific, for sure.
Gary Disher is his character Hershey is wonderful. The Peace Road series, I think there's 3 of them.
Yeah, I think so.
I really like them. It's interesting that he's put his character in a dry, it's not the outback, but a dry bush setting. and it's radically different from mine.
Definitely. All right, guys. Well, it might be a good place to sort of stop for me. If we want to jump to question time now, anybody got some burning questions to ask? No? We'll go to you first.
Okay. Frank, how do you go writing the rape scenes? Like you, when I see them on television, I can't watch. And I always assumed it was just they were there for gratuitous purposes. And it was lovely to hear you say you're writing about it to draw attention to the problem. But how do you go writing that stuff? And especially when you said initially you put it in there to make draw attention to it and realise
that I can't do that. Well, in Conviction, the attacks on the two girls don't occur in the book. They've already occurred. So that's one of my ways of dealing with it. In I shouldn't talk about it too. It's very hard when I've heard other writers say this, and I thought they're just a bit smartasses, but I've heard them say, "Oh, I'm a bit vague about book one now because I'm so deep into book two," and I thought, "Wake up!" But it kind of gets you because the gaps it takes so long for these processes. The short answer to your question is I'm working on it. I think that if I write a scene that depicts an attack on a woman, that is a different creature from writing a scene that depicts an attack on a man. It's just, I don't feel common ground at all. And it doesn't matter to me how the woman fights back or not. It's like it's so heavy with baggage that I'm not sure. Another approach I've tried is that someone's come along afterwards and has tried to recreate what happened in great detail. And that was the scene that I'm worried about, because that sort of forces you through the actual attack. And I don't know, I mean, part of me says we are too glib about violence. And I mean, boy, if anyone is accused of that, it would be the crime genre. But the alternative doesn't seem to be to rub our noses in it. Maybe a parallel is the road safety campaigns, because I was involved in projects many years ago, in writing scripts about ways to sell road safety. One of them was it had to be sold to teenagers. You know, how do you get teenagers to be more aware of the dangers of on the road? And there was one school of thought that was dominant at the time, which said, show the consequences, show the busted bodies, show the sorts of things that an ambo sees, and we'll pay attention. And that's the thinking behind the kinds of pictures that you see on cigarette packets. Well, the research isn't as positive about that. Doesn't mean to say that it's not the right thing to do for some people, and it will correct the way they operate, but it's not a panacea. I mean, the worst kind of writing is if you get the hint that the writer's rather enjoying writing the attack. I mean, that I'd be horrified if I was accused of that. But I understand the appeal. And I'm not sure what to do about it. The other thing that you're told to do is don't let the victim be only a victim. So, like a rule of writing is if something dreadful is going to happen to somebody, we should know enough about that somebody to care when they're hurt. Whereas if you just show it in the opening scene that someone that you've never seen before is getting beaten up, male or female actually, well, you don't care. You know, it's over and it's done and you've moved on, and that person isn't really a person at all because they haven't been developed properly as a character. So, I mean, that's another way that I try to do it, that if violence happens to anybody, I try to make it that we know enough about that person to know that it's really hurt them. But I don't know. It's ongoing problem. It's interesting that it's the question of the explicitness of the violence is a relatively contemporary issue. I mean, Dostoevsky didn't write about the violence in that way. Dickens didn't write about the violence in that way. But we do. And we do it more and more, actually. I don't know if I'm just talking.
No, thank you. It's good to hear all your different thoughts.
Yeah.
I think we had another question at the back there.
Oh, yes. You mentioned the rough draft 8 years ago and the strange backwards process, but I was wondering about if you could describe the genesis of wanting this particular story to be your novel.
This one.
Yeah, that this story was the story that you were crafting into what would be the novel.
I certainly don't start with a finished idea. I have no idea where it's going. I knew that Ray had to be in trouble and that he was being kicked out of Brisbane. And so I put him on a train, and I put him on that train because I remember train trips and I really liked them, the old wooden carriages and everything. And I knew that it would be a shock for him if he arrived out west thinking, oh, well, the corruption won't be out here, but it was. And apart from that, I don't know where it came from. The nasty cop that he encounters first, I guess is just a collection of nastinesses that I've come across in the years. I put them together, I don't know. Sorry, don't know. But as I said, the process of the characters talking to me is very real. So that helps. And I don't understand that process. I don't want to mess with it, but I don't understand it.
Just as a follow-up, from the way you described that, it kind of sounds like Ray was the character that existed in your mind first, and at least in some part originally the story came from that, from telling you where he was going.
Yeah, I think that that's probably true, yes, that I needed some sense of who Ray was. I knew that he needed to have his own share of violence in him to be able to just get by with the kind of police and people that were around in those days. I mean, it's a bit of a burden for men in lots of environments where if you go in with the wrong attitude, you're going to cop it. You know, you've got to be able to. The cliche is that in prison, you know, you don't ever show weakness, although you'll get thumped. Well, it ain't just in prison. You know, it's all over, and men kind of cop that a lot. So I wanted Ray to have dealt with that, and the boxing. I really like boxing. I don't like what Mike Tyson did to it, and Joyce Carol Oates has written beautifully on that. But I really like boxing. It's the discipline that emerges from the violence. And as I say, and as one of the characters says in the book, who's going to win, the boxer or the brawler? Well, I think that's a really interesting question for men anyway. So yeah, there were bits and pieces. You know, the boxing came to me. Heading out west where I'd met all those people who told me stories helped. I haven't had any feedback from country towns yet. We'll see.
You've got to do a rural tour next time.
Yeah. It's being read. I have it on on first-hand authority that it's being read out in the general area where I set it.
Which is where, right?
Well, it's sort of between. Well, in Indigenous terms, it's in the lands of the Mundundunji and the Barungium, which is sort of between from Chinchilla to Roma, roughly speaking. Yeah.
Hoping for a good response from them.
well, it'll be a bit like being editors, you know. I really want to hear,
Yeah.
and I've made it plain that I really want to hear. So I have a kind of standing invite to go out and listen, and I will take that up.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Who else, guys?
Sorry.
No, you're fine.
I don't know if you're allowed, if you want to reveal things about the themes, for those of us who haven't read your book yet, but is it an empathy for men who like almost have to be violent to survive?
Yeah, there is. Yeah, there is.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I've seen quite a few pub fights, just because I've been in those environments, and I'm shaking. I get upset now thinking about them.
And boxing is the means for men to express themselves in a more ordered way, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. There are rules.
Yeah.
There are rules, and you have to obey the rules. Well, nobody has to, but that's the plan. Yeah, I got a lot of sympathy for them. And the story of a rough cop intervening in the life of someone who has turned up in pub brawls too often and told them to get in the ring. That's not such an uncommon story. That was at a time when the police had, because there were so few rules, when they could grab that person. And as I've got one character having, the cop throws him in the jail cell and says, "This is where you're going to end up if you keep brawling behind the pub. Why don't you get in the ring and show whether you've got real guts or whatever?" Well, it's not about real guts, but it is about what you're going to do to cope with all of that violence. I remember I was doing martial arts at one stage, feels like in another lifetime, and I really enjoyed doing it in Brisbane. Then we moved to Sydney for a while, and I was ringing around about martial arts places. And one place has always stuck in my memory, because when I asked the guy about, his styles of fighting and so on, he said, "Oh, we don't worry about any of that spiritual shit. We just get in there and fight." I thought, well, no, I'm not going there, because that's not what martial arts is about. But it can be for people who want it to be. So I don't know what you do about it, but I feel like it's probably presumptuous of me, but I feel like I can tell pretty quickly with men where they are on this scale. And unfortunately, it shows up a lot in how they're with their women. It can be really crude. Like just this morning, I saw a man and a wife, I presume it was his wife, in a grocery shop. And they're both just standing still looking at the shelves, and she just moved to go and get something off the shelves. He clipped his fingers and told her to get back, so she got back. Well, the violence that was in that exchange was palpable. And, well, what are you going to do? You're going to intervene? And how can you intervene in a constructive way? And why you? What are you bringing to it that makes you good to do it? Anyway, yeah.
What about you?
A question about your writerly commitment. More than 8 years working on draft after draft, paying to have assessments done, searching for an agent and waiting for that agent to, when you finally got an agent, waiting for that person to find a publisher. Been a long process of publishing. What do you reckon has sustained your commitment and determination to keep struggling on through that more than 8 years towards this?
Well, people like you, because Fran is an early reader of my manuscripts. People like Julie, the people I give credit to at the end of my book, who are wonderful about telling me what's good and what's bad in the project. So it's people who read for me, but who read in a quasi-professional way. one needs to be very careful who one gives the manuscript to. Is that an? I mean, I think I learned a lot of patience in being a scriptwriter, because the usual fate of the scriptwriter is my fate. That I got 4 or 5 commissions to write feature films from reputable producers. I had a serious producer for a 4-part miniseries that I wrote, and I've had play on the ABC, anyway, etc. And none of them were, well, play on the ABC was obviously made, but the rest of them, nothing was made.
So you were used to rejection, so you just battled on.
Yeah, you get real used to rejection, but it's interesting. There's a difference between, quite often I found, and this is not to overstate the quality of my scripts, but I got used to getting really positive comments about my scripts, and then no positive comments from the market to give us the money to make those scripts. So that the producers were really loyal and liked the scripts, and the readers, for the people with money, they were very generous. And with the miniseries, SBS tried twice to get it going. And so, you know, people give you reason to believe that what you've done is worth a look. And that's really nice. But scriptwriters have it tough, you know. It's pretty normal for a scriptwriter to have nothing made, nothing. I don't know if that answers.
Do you have any questions on Zoom? Oh, I'm so sorry.
No, that's all right. So a comment and a question. So the comment, I had a student that had at the Griffith Film School that had grown up in Dalby, and Shane Armstrong was script editing her work. And I remember a comment she said about violence was that Shane said he'd grown up in a Dalby pub and that people were always fighting in the back lane. But unlike, you know, young men dying in the streets of Fortitude Valley, nobody ever died, but there was almost a performative element. So I'm interested in a comment on that. Crime doesn't usually grab me. I love The Dry. I love Mystery Road. I love Mystery Road.
Oh, yeah, that's
You know, I love Mystery Road as the feature set in Winton. Actually, I've really enjoyed it set in Western Australia. So take me in, Frank. What's going to grab me in fiction that is for somebody that doesn't usually get into crime? And actually, The Dry I loved too. That's an impossible question, but you'll make of it what you will.
I don't know what I do know that crime novels can be a hard sell amongst those who prefer what's called literary novels.
Guilty as charged, Your Honour.
Yeah, whereas I think, I'll say it, a lot of so-called literary novels are just bad philosophy. And if had they done Philosophy 101, they could have saved us a lot of whereas crime novels, I think, are pithier. They get to the point more quickly. I cannot stand not getting to the point. I think that's what my philosophy training. Plato said there's an ancient quarrel between poetry and philosophy, and by poetry he meant drama, fiction, etc. And that's because in philosophy you aim at all times for clarity and succinctness. In other words, you try to get it all out there explicitly. Fiction is not like that. In fact, you could say it's the opposite. You're absolutely not trying to get it out there. You're trying to hide it or seed it along the way. So if your preference is for literary novels, well, I may already have just burnt that bridge. But I can say that by and large, the distinction breaks down and is unsustainable. Is Hilary Mantel a crime writer? Is Dostoevsky a crime writer? You know, I find it pointless really. And it's only if provoked that I make my philosophy 101 comment.
Now, do we have any Zoom questions?
We do have some questions from Zoom. This one's from Ben, and he says, in previous projects, I understand that you get a lot of enjoyment and creative juice from talking with people and developing other people's stories. So how do you maintain your creative juices when working on your own story?
I take their stories apart and I use the bits that I want. And sometimes, like the guy with the bomb on his plough, you can't take that story apart. You know, it's like it's obdurate. There's nothing you can do with it. But you try to enter into the bigger picture of the story that you're being told. One of the boxes that we included in our 1950s ex-boxing champion museum thing, he told a story. This was a man in his mid-70s, my age now. He worked in a coal mine in the early 50s, from like 4 in the morning until midday, and he got together enough money to buy a small farm. And when he finished the 8 hours, and he worked 8 hours in a trench underground that he said if it was 3 feet high, it was a lucky day. I mean, it's inconceivable to me how he did that. But one day he got home and all of his stock, he didn't have many cattle, but all of it had been shot because someone had, well, gone bonkers with a rifle. And he told the police that who were investigating, he went with them because the guy was caught at another place trying to kill people. He went with the police in the hope that he could have, as he put it, 5 minutes alone with that bloke. And of course it would have been dreadful. And unfortunately the police didn't let him anywhere near it. Now, I would love to use that story because I have met that man and I have felt, he cried when he told me the story, and it was 50 years old, you know, the story. That's a story where I would have to take it whole as bolus and make it develop him as the character in it. But there are other stories where people just give me a glimpse at things that they've done. Like the bloke lighting the match at the door, you know, I could use that in lots of different ways. It wouldn't matter who the guy was. So it's horses for courses. It depends on the people. I mean, one time I went to, people would invite me to their homes, which I thought was very generous of them because they didn't know me. But sometimes I just, because there was, you know, no mobile phones and they didn't have what they were anyway. Sometimes they didn't even have landlines. I went to the door of this house and a woman answered the door, and she would have been probably in her 70s, it's a bit hard to tell, excuse me, 60s or 70s. And I did my pitch on how I'm here to listen to, I'd love to hear about stories, you know. And she said, nothing has ever happened to me. And that was so sad, you know, and it was surely untrue, but that's I don't know what to do with that. So it depends, you know, it depends on what people tell you. I think.
Any more questions, Scott?
Oh yeah, we've just got
We might have one more.
Yeah, I think we've just got time for one more as well. So this one is from Michael, and he says, I know you have a strong sense of justice, and I'd be interested to hear your response to the proposition that as a writer, you are able to wield the sword of justice in a world of your own creation.
Yes, I can do that. And I love doing that. But unless it's persuasive, it's a waste of time. I'm reading a novel now, which will remain nameless, where I feel I'm being hit by the club of justice, and I'm being told over and over to clean up my act, you know, in this area of life, and I can't be bothered. I can't finish it. I don't finish novels anymore if I don't like them. Life is too short. I'll give them 50 or 60 pages, but beyond that, I won't. So if you wield the sword of justice in a way that is unconvincing, I think you're liable to provoke the opposite. Michael knows that.
A boxer versus brawlers, I guess.
Yeah.
All right, so where are we at? 7:30. I think it's a great place to end. So thank you so much, Frank. Let's do a big round of applause. Thanks for bearing with me as well.
You did very well.
Oh, thank you. Okay, guys, so the book's available to purchase inside, so please head in. Will the signing table, Oscar's going to set up now, and we'll bring Frank inside. He can sign some books, and the bar's still open as well, so you're more than welcome to have a drink.
Is it okay if I just take a quick shot?
Do you want me to